Hello everyone, my name is Amaouz Hamad and welcome to the fourth video of the Wireless Guest Network Deployment series. This video will focus on configuring the web authentication parameter and authentication method list, as well as credentials for the guest to validate. The guest network solution allows for guests to be authenticated via credentials created locally on the wireless LAN controller or an external radio server. There are various forms of authentication to authenticate the guest, which include web authentication, which is a form of authentication that requires the guest to provide a valid username and password before they are allowed to access the internet. We have the consent form of authentication, where guests would have to accept a consent, which can be a privacy policy from the company. We have the web consent form of authentication, which provides a mixture of both the web authentication and the consent form of authentication. Here, guests would have to accept a consent banner as well as provide valid credentials to access the internet. In this configuration video, we will create a web authentication form of authentication as well as create local credentials on the controller that would be used to validate the clients. It is important to note that the web authentication services is provided by the anchor controller, since that is the controller they are tunneled to and from which they receive an IP address. To configure the web authentication parameter map, the web authentication parameter map sets parameters that can be applied to subscriber sessions during authentication. If you do not create a parameter map, the policy uses default parameters. Let's get right into the configuration video. To configure the web authentication parameter map, on the dashboard, we'll go to Configuration and under Security, select Web Auth. We'll select on Add to create a new web authentication with the parameter map name Guest. The maximum HTTP connection, which refers to the number of HTTP connections that can be opened concurrently, as well as the initial state timeouts, can be left empty and filled in with the default values. It can also be configured to the company's policy preferences. We'll select the type of authentication, which is Web Auth, and select Click to apply. We'll select the newly created web authentication parameter map, and under General, we can see the settings that can be further edited. We have the banner title, which would have been done if we were creating a web consent or consent form of authentication. We also have the maximum HTTP connection and the initial timeout seconds, which can be left with the default values or configured to the company's profile preferences. The sleeping client status, which allows for the guest to be able to wake up without having to go through another authentication process through the login page, can be configured. In this configuration, we would not be doing that, but if we click in the box, it would give us the opportunity to configure the timeout minutes that we would like. We'll leave that empty. We'll select Update and Apply. Now that we've created the web authentication parameter map, it is necessary to apply it to the guest WLAN that the guest will be joining. This is done on the anchor controller. We'll go to Configuration and under Tags and Profiles, select WLAN. We'll click on the guest WLAN and under Security, select Layer 3. We'll check the web policy box since we'll be applying a policy to the web. And under the web authentication parameter map, we'll select Guest. The authentication list that will be used to authenticate the guest will be Select Default, since Default allows for the guest to be authenticated locally. We'll select Update and Apply to Device. This allows for all guests joining the guest WLAN to be for this web authentication parameter map to be applied to them. I'll go ahead and show you how to configure the authentication list. We'll go to Configuration and under Security, select AAA. Now, it's taking a moment to load. Now, under the AAA method list, we'll select Authentication. We can see here that the default has a type login with a group type local, which allows for local authentication. Hence, we use the default. But to create a new one, we could select Add, and we would have a different type such as .1x or login, and with the group type, we can have local or group. If we were using an external server, we would have selected the available server groups and pushed it to the assigned server for guests to be authenticated using those server groups. That's how to create the AAA method list, authentication method list, to apply to the WLAN policy profile. Now, to create the credentials that the guest will be used to authenticate, that the guest will provide to authenticate before accessing the internet, we'll go to configuration, and under security, select guest user. We'll select add and create a username and password that would allow for the guest the guest will use to authenticate. I'll go ahead and fill this in. Now, with these credentials filled in with the username of Cisco and password of Cisco, guests that provide these username and password will be able to successfully access the internet. We can also configure the number of simultaneous user logins, where we will have a number of users that can use these credentials to access the internet. To have unlimited users, we would have to enter 0. The lifetime also allows us to configure how long we'd have the guest to access the internet and for how long. We'll leave them as 1 day or 24 hours. This is how to create a guest user credential. We can create multiple ones that can be used, but for now we're just using Cisco. We'll select apply to device. And this is what the guest will use to authenticate the internet. We'll go ahead and check and ensure that our guests are able to connect to the guest network. Using these are able to connect to the guest network, as well as validate and access the internet with these credentials. I'll see you in the next video where we do that.